Okay, so we are on Lamed Dalet Amud Beis. We started the Mishnah. The Mishnah deals with the interesting exchange of someone who rents an animal and then lends it to someone else, meaning it changes reshus, but it also changes.
Lamed Dalet Amud or Lamed Hay on base?
Lamed Dalet. We're on Lamed.
Hey.
Lamed Hay Amud Beis. Pardon me. Lamed Hay Amud Beis. The Mishnah. So we're talking about someone who rents an animal and then lends it to someone else. So we're talking about two different types of responsibilities, that of a lender and that of a borrower. They have different qualities, as we know. A soicher is chayiv for gneva aveda, pshia. A shoel is chayiv even for ones. So there's greater responsibility. There's no exchange of money, but there's greater responsibility. So the Gemara gave us an interesting presentation, and where we left off was with the somewhat astounding prospect that if an owner himself rents out his animal to someone else, and that person then lends it to someone else, there is the possibility that given the chain of events, the owner himself can be responsible to pay the worth of the animal to the renter, which sounds absolutely not within the realm of what we understand. And there were numerous questions that came up as a result of it, because under the chain of what the events are, the owner, if he borrows it back from the renter, becomes liable. And if he becomes liable, something happens, who's he liable to? He's liable to the person who he rented it to. And that person can then, according to what the Gemara tells us, wind up with several cows that, in this particular case, two, because there were two events, but he can, the owner has to pay the renter the cows, which he rented him in the first place, and the renter can keep them. So that's a mamish, it defies our understanding, and several of you asked good questions about how that can be, because the Chayra, that should not be the case. But the Gemara says, and the Gemara says this as a, doesn't say it as a maskana, it says Amar Rav Zera. Rav Zera says there are times when this can happen because of the nature of the way the flow of the animals go. So that's where we left off last week, and we left it sort of hanging. Is that really the case? So I said, just wait a little bit, because today we're going to clarify that event is somewhat it's a very tenuous situation. So let's look at Amar of Acha Medifta the Ravina, which is about maybe 10 or so lines from the bottom of the Amud. Amar Rav Acha Medifta the Ravina. Okay, let's examine what happened here. Mechde. Choda Parahi, one animal, Aila va'afka, it basically moved from place to place, Aila va'afka, Afka mischiras va'aila l'shila. It went from schirus, and as the owner gave it to the seicher to rent va'aila l'shila, then it went to borrowing, Afka mishila va'aila l'schirus. And it went back from sheila to schirus. So Rav Acha Medifta says, you can't have a situation where the owner, or whoever in this case, it was the owner of the cow, but that was just the example. The Mishnah is talking about anybody else who rents it. You can't have a situation where the person who owns the cow, or who has the cow, is going to wind up having to repay the value of the cow to someone he rents it to, because it's one cow that just changed its legal position. It went from schirus to being a she'ela, or she'ela to being a schirus. So according to Rav Acha Medifta, there's only one cow here. And all at the end of the day that has to be repaid is one cow. In other words, I don't hold from Rav Zera that there's multiple cows that have to be paid, because it was the same cow that came exchanging hands. Okay, so, and that's logical. That was the logical answer. But comes along Ravina and says, Umi Isa Lapara Be'ena, the name Alehaki, is the cow in front of us that you should save it. In other words, I'm going to challenge you. You're telling me there was one cow, and that cow was the one that kept bouncing around. But where's the cow? If the cow was here, says Ravina, I can understand. You could say there's one cow, and it just keeps bouncing around. But is it here? In other words, mi isa lapara be'ina, is it in front of our eyes, the name Elehachi, that we should say this, that there's only one cow, and that's all you can say. Says Rashi, Ilo hoise kayemes, if this cow was alive, hoya potter legamre, he would be completely potter. But he has to give him the 20 days at the end of that second rental. To remember, he rented it for 70 of the 90 days. So okay, you have to supplement the 20 days because he rented it for that extra 20 days. But Achshav Shemesa, now that the animal died, right? Now that the animal died, Bo'olav B'Torah's Tashlumin, Shoa L'Soker Al Shtei Tviyos. Now we're talking about Tashlumin. Tashlumin means making payments, not just supplementing the 20 days. So that's his kasha.
Rabbi,
go ahead.
a quick question.
Yeah.
We're talking about somebody that's borrowing an animal, and then he rents it out to somebody else.
No, the other way around. The other way around.
Somebody rents out an animal.
I rent you an animal, and
Yes.
you went ahead and lent it. You lent it, but not to pay. You lent it to Menashe.
A friend of mine.
Right.
Okay. Now, if I'm paying you for the rental of it,
Correct.
does that give me the authority to let somebody else have it or to rent it out to someone else?
As long as it was not discussed and agreed that you couldn't do that, the answer is yes.
Now, if something,
you have full authority, and we're going to see from later in the Gemara what that means. In other words, it's not so simple, but the straight answer is, unless I say to you, David, this animal I'm renting to you, here are the conditions of the rental, and you can't give it to Menashe. You can't just do that.
I can't. Now, if the animal should get hurt or damaged or damages something, the liability really goes on me, not on the person that I lent it to.
Okay, so now let's stop and think a minute. What are you liable for? To me, you're liable for Geneva, for Aveda, for Pshia. If you're careless or it gets stolen or lost from you, then you, the socher, the renter, have responsibilities to me. If the animal dies in the course of its work, let's say you're working and it dies in the course of work, there's no liability, because that liability, you can't have liability when it is doing what you rented it to do. Okay, now, when you gave it to the borrower, you gave it to Menashe. Menashe said, can I borrow this cow? I need it for something, and you gave it to him, then he has an additional responsibility that you don't have, and that is called ones, accident. If the animal is accidentally killed, you have no responsibility to me, but Menashe has a responsibility to you, because a borrower has greater responsibilities than someone who rents. A renter has certain responsibilities. He can't be careless. It can't be stolen from him. Those are the normal things. But ones, an accident, no. You, the socher, have no responsibility. But so Menashe does. So Menashe has to pay you. Right? And the question is, do you have to pay me? So last week we postulated that you don't have to pay me anything because it died through an ones, and you are not responsible to me for ones, but you get money from Menashe because Menashe is responsible for ones. So we have a situation where you make out from Menashe, but I don't make out from you.
Okay, but when you let me rent it from you, I assume that you know me. You're not just going to lend it to just anybody, or at least have some knowledge of who I am. you're giving it to me on my reputation that you know me. If I mean, what right do I really have to rent it out? I mean, to lend it to somebody else. They're not going to take as much care of whatever it is, an animal or a machine.
Okay, so you're now exploring areas that I think are a little bit afar from where we are right now, because the truth of the matter is, the Mishnah does not say that it's a situation where I know you or you know me and we have any kind of relationship prior to this event. It doesn't say it. So we can assume that you were referred to me, that I have a cow that I rent out. You need a cow. So you came to me and said, listen, Tuvia, I know you have a cow. You rent it out. I'll pay you $100. And I said, fine, it's a good transaction. Whether I know who you are or I ask recommendations, it doesn't matter. Now, what did I stipulate? I may have stipulated certain things in the course of our agreement, but I did not stipulate that you can take the cow and lend it to someone. I never said that in the agreement that we had, which means that you may do it. I can stipulate and say it, but I didn't. That was not one of the conditions that I made. So you have no responsibility to me vis-a-vis lending it to a third person. You went ahead and lent it to a third person. That person has greater responsibilities than you do, because he's also chayiv in ones, as I said. He's chayiv for an accident. You're not chayiv for an accident.
Excuse me, Rabbi.
Yeah.
Why isn't it implied that when you rent something from somebody, you're not allowed to give it to, lend it out to somebody else? Shouldn't that be the normal?
Okay, so not okay. So since a couple of you have asked it, I have to postpone. There will be that situation in the Gemara where this happens. In other words, you're asking, shouldn't there be? And the Gemara will address it. It's just that right now we're not interested in it. Right now, the facts are that I rented it to you, and I only said, be careful. Just be careful. I said nothing more. You were careful, but you know Menashe, and you said, fine, Menashe, you're a responsible guy. You need to borrow it for 10 days, 20 days. Here, borrow it for 10 days. Okay, so everything was done innocently. No one was doing anything behind anybody's back, because there was no prohibition from doing what we want to do here. The only complication is that not everybody is equal. The soicher vis-a-vis the owner is not equal to the shoel vis-a-vis the socher. The shoel vis-a-vis the socher has a greater responsibility to the socher than the socher has to me as the owner. That's where the imbalance comes in. That's where the Mishnah says, so what do we do here? So the socher is free from paying the owner because it was an accident. But the shoel, who is responsible for accidents because he doesn't pay, he's a freebie. So he has greater responsibility. So he owes the socher. So we said
a question though. What happens? Let's say, okay, it wasn't. The cow didn't die in an accident. Okay, we were talking about that here. Let's say instead the cow was stolen from me, while I had borrowed it from David, who had rented it from you. I'm now responsible for paying for it, right?
And you're the shoel.
Correct.
Yeah.
Okay. So am I supposed to pay David, or am I supposed to pay you, the owner of the cow?
So according to the Tanakhama, the Mishnah, you have to pay David. You remember, if you look at the very last line, 2 lines of the Mishnah, Rabbi Yossi objected to this and said, why not cut out the middleman and have you pay me directly? In other words, Rabbi Yossi said, Kate said, he's doing business with my cow. That's not right. Right. Skip the middleman and come right to me. That was Rabbi Yossi's. That's not the Tanakhama, that's Rabbi Yossi.
Okay.
So in other words, there is.
It seems to me that's the key, because that's the determining factor over who's really should be deserving the money.
Responsible at the end.
Right.
Exactly.
Okay.
In other words, does the soicher get a free pass because he did nothing wrong vis-a-vis the owner, right? Now you postulated a different situation. You said it was stolen
Right, it was
That's it.
stolen from me. So now everybody agrees I'm responsible to pay for it, right?
Right?
Okay. And the question is, I know that it's your cow. It's not David's. I know that David had rented it. Who am I paying? So the question then is, who am I paying it?
Right. So when you raise the question,
The
of
same
cow,
amount either way.
the cow was stolen and not died of
Accident.
ones, so that can change the facts because this both the socher and the shoel are chayiv for geneva.
Right.
For ones, only the shoel is chayiv. The socher is not chayiv. So the socher is completely off the hook. And that's the case of our Gemara. You're saying, well, wait a minute, it didn't die accidentally, it was stolen.
Right.
If it was stolen, then the socher can't turn around and say to the owner, I don't owe you anything because it was stolen.
Right.
The
The question is, so my question then is, who am I really liable to?
Okay, so under the way the Mishnah is postulating it, the shoel is chayiv to the socher, and the socher is chayiv to me. Why do I say that? Because if it was an ones and not a geneva, then the shoel would be chayiv to the socher, and the socher would not be chayiv to me.
Right.
So I'm following the same track, and I'm saying each one is chayiv to the next one on the chain.
At whatever level they either are or not chayiv.
Correct. So that was this whole discussion that we had here. And again, it's a very complicated discussion because and I think it was Michael even who asked at the end of this year, he said, I mean, you really have to sort of, as they say, you have to hold on to your hat here because it's the same, because how does this happen that multiple animals become responsible to be repaid when there weren't multiple animals? So Rav Acha Medifta came and said, you know what, you're 100% right. You're creating a mountain out of matchsticks and it doesn't hold. There's one cow here. The cow just bounced around from being rented to borrowed to rented. At the end of the day, there's one cow. So that's why Rashi wanted to articulate and said so therefore there's only one cow. Frekt Ravina, but where's the cow? If the cow was here, so let's logically think of this. If we're three people, I'm an owner, you're a socher, and the third person's a shower. There's a cow in front of us. There was only one cow in this entire transaction, and the cow's in front of us. Who is going to now say that this cow has morphed into multiple cows that have to be paid back? That makes no sense whatsoever. So Ravina says, you know what, Rav Acha Medifta, you're right. There's one cow. We can't stretch that cow into 3 cows or 4 cows. But where is the cow? So when he's asking where's the cow, what he's saying is, so how are we going to make this happen? You rented a cow. The person who rented it has entitled to use the cow. The cow died. There is a halacha that if the cow dies, it has to be repaid. Where is the cow? If you show me the cow and tell me this is the cow to be repaid, and then this is also the cow that I'm going to have my last 20 days of work, I'm with you. But there's no cow. So we have to, in essence, manufacture a cow. We have to say there's one cow that we have to create for the purpose of tashlumin, as Rashi said. You got to pay him because he rented a cow. But now that you pay him for the cow, he rented it for 90 or 70 days in this case. What does he do? That cow now belongs to him. He needs another cow to finish his work. So that's Ravina's answer in this Rashi. If the cow was alive, there would be no second cow. He just finishes his 20 days. Now that cow died, all of a sudden, tashlumin. There has to be tashlumin. There has to be repayment of what? Of shoel l'socher al shtei tviyas. There are 2 contested issues. One is the cow itself, because he lent it to him for 20 days, and then he's got to get it back to work it for the final 20 days. So that's Ravina's kasha. Again, the kasha is a little bit on shaky grounds because we're still puzzled why we need 2 cows. He said we don't need 2 cows if it's in front of us. But if it's not in front of us, then we do need it. So let's just go to say that Ravina is now going to be, we're going to slug him up. And Mar Baravashi Omar, Mar Baravashi says, Ein lo alem ela shtei paros. There are only 2 cows here. Choda d'shola v'choda d'schiras. One is for borrowing and one is for renting. Shum she'ela achas hi, v'shum she'ela schiras achas hi. And in terms of the state that they're in, then when one is being rented, it's in a state of rental. In other words, you can rent it 3 times. It doesn't matter. It's all one rental. In other words, rental is rental, even though our fact pattern is that he rented it and then re-rented it a second and borrowed it and rented it and borrowed it. In other words, that was the complication, is because it happened multiple times. Says my Bravashi, every schiras is 1, and every she'ila is 1. He she'ila kana legamre, the schiras of it bo yemei schiras, right? Umahadele lamare. So he is definitively saying, like Rav Acha Medifta, that even though there is not a cow present, because Ravina said, where's the cow? If the cow would be here, I would agree with you. He said, it doesn't matter. Every time you rent again, it's part of the first rental. It's not a new rental. Remember, he rented to him for 100 days, borrowed it for 90. Rented to him, and then he rented it again for 80 and borrowed it again for 70. So it was a declining case, but it seems like every case was a new case. He was doing it again. Says Mar Bravashi, no. In this complicated matter, we have 1 cow, and that cow, like Rav Acha Medifta basically said, and that cow switches rishus from schiros to she'ela, from she'ela to schiros. And at the end of the day, there was 1 cow, and I don't buy the fact that if the cow's not here, all of a sudden we need a second cow. No, we don't need a second cow. That cow was the one. You need to have 1 cow. That cow has to be the cow that at the end of the day, at the finish line, is the cow that does the work, and it goes back to the owner. This was never a sale. It was a rental and a borrowing. So the rental and the borrowing together equal 1 cow, not 1 cow plus 1 cow. So according to that understanding, we now say that this fact pattern that Rav Zera imposed of multiple payments can't happen, because you can't have 1 cow that morphs into a second cow when it's really the same one being lent at the same time. Now, all of your questions are valid when it comes to who should be the recipient of the money, how should it really be done, what's fair, what's right, what's not right. So basically what we are saying is, and we've said this all the time, is if you're going to make a transaction, you've got to be specific in the transaction. If you don't want him to rent it to someone else, say it in the contract. Otherwise, why shouldn't he rent it? Now, the Gemara is going to make certain hypotheses that we're going to see as to whether or not that's an appropriate thing to do. But for our purposes, face value, everybody got his money's worth. I'm the owner, I rented it, I got schiras. You wanted to do a favor to Menashe, and you wanted to lend it to him because he's a good friend. You lent it to him. I didn't prohibit it. Now, if the animal died, now we have to sort of piece the facts together, as I said, because everybody is in a different category of responsibility, and one person is responsible when one isn't, and we just have to sort of tie the loose ends together. But it seems that from the end of the day, both Rav Acha Medifta and Mar Bravashi seem to conclude that there is 1 cow, and we don't follow Rav Zera's theory that the owner now has to pay multiple amounts of it. Yeah, just excuse me 1 moment.
Yeah.
Where's the sheet?
It was on my phone. It was on in the morning, it was on. No, it's on my
Okay, I'm sorry. Okay. So
Question.
that's where we wind up now at this point in time. Now, there will be some other questions that we're going to address that some of you have asked, but just for purposes of understanding this Gemara, we're not going to make the owner of the animal have to pay out multiple times because this animal died, and let the socher, the renter, have a windfall. And that's really what Rav Yossi says in the Mishnah, because Rav Yossi says, someone is making business with someone else's property. Now, and what I mentioned was that today we have contracts that specifically prohibit that. In other words, many contracts that I've been involved with say that you cannot transact business in our business. If I'm lending you something, whether it's a piece of real estate or a piece of machinery or everything else, we have clauses that don't allow you to have a windfall against me. Now, it does say perhaps that someone else can pay you, but you have to pay me. In other words, I, the owner, should not be the one left without anything. But these are today's contracts that are more specific. Clearly, in the time of the Gemara, it was much more of an open matter where they weren't so specific, or they didn't think someone would do it or whatever. So they did. That's why we ask these questions, because in the context of today's society, this doesn't really make too much sense to us why this would happen. But that's not, again, in the time of the Gemara, this is the way business was transacted, and people weren't makbid about writing a contract saying don't rent it to someone else or do rent it to someone else. They were makbid, period.
A question. So if you rent, you're responsible for certain types of things without stolen, etc. If you borrow for free, you're responsible in addition for accidental damage.
Correct.
Is there anything that a renter is responsible for that a borrower is not?
No.
Okay, and given that, I was pretty sure that was the answer. Given that, I'm renting the cow for $10. David's renting the cow for $10 a day from you. He decides, say, hey, can I borrow the cow? Could David turn to me and say, I got 30 days left on this contract, but I'm not going to let you borrow it. I'm going to rent it to you for $1 for 30 days. And we hear about these contracts, where somebody rents a whole building for $1 because of, whatever reasons. Would that be a valid rental? Because if so, then that would keep me off the hook of accidental damage.
Keep you the show.
Yeah.
So the answer is, as long as there was no specific condition that the owner made with the soker of what he could and couldn't.
Right. As long as it was open,
as long as he wasn't negligent. Here's the key: as long as the soker wasn't negligent in what he was doing with the third guy.
Right. If David knows that I'm the guy who takes the cows and then takes them to the bullfighting ring and whatever, and there's likely to be problems, then obviously that would be different. But assuming that I'm just an ordinary farmer, just needs an extra cow, and nothing, strange, but I'm a little down on my money, so I can't afford $10 a day. He's got it. He's got enough cows. He's stuck with this contract and says, you know what, for $1, I'm going to rent it to you instead of letting me simply borrow it.
Right. But remember, what is our objective? Our objective is to protect the owner. The owner is the one who we want to protect to make sure.
But in a way, but in this case, it protects me by doing this thing for $1. It protects me because that dollar becomes insurance against accidental damage in a sense.
That's correct. And there's no prohibition for doing that. None whatsoever, unless it was articulated.
Right.
So you protect yourself, but ultimately it's the owner that shouldn't be out anything because you did something with a third guy that may or may not affect the chain of liability. So yes, the answer is you can do that. The reason why we picked Shoel is to show, because a Shoel has one extra layer of responsibility that a socher doesn't have. Because let's just say that in your fact pattern, it died during the work. Who's responsible? A socher is not responsible for ones. So neither you or the other guy who rented it from you is responsible. Now the owner's going to say, wait a minute, I have a dead animal. Who's going to pay me? Well, the answer is no one's going to pay you because there was never liability for ones. And that's what the Gemara now is going to introduce us to in a minute to see if we can deal with that. We'll talk about that. But that's a good point, is that if he then rented it to someone else, then ones was never on the table. An accident was never on the table and never became the subject of a discussion. Okay, so bottom line, Rav Zera's theory, we don't hold from Rav Zera's theory. We don't say that you heap on these liabilities, because at the end of the day, it's one animal, and al pi seichel, you can't take one animal and make chiyuvim for multiple animals. That's really what it is. So Rav Zera's really was just a hypothetical discussion, and we have a conclusion that tells us, no, you can't do it. Okay. Now, we're gonna move sideways a little bit on the same question, and then we're gonna come up to the questions we're talking about. So there is a halacha, separate halacha, that that says as follows. In other words, when you we know about shvuos. We know that shvuos are frowned upon. We don't want to take shvuos, and there's a whole history in the Torah and in the halacha about making shvuos. But there are some shvuos that have to be made. And remember that recently we came upon such a shvuah because Rav Huna came and said, you know what? Even if you're a man who doesn't swear, you need to swear that you did not, it's not in your possession. In other words, yes, there was an accident and the cow was injured or the article was lost. Okay, fine. So the Gemara says, under those circumstances, you don't have to make a shvuah. But at least you have to make a shvuah and tell me you don't still have it and are hiding it from me. That shvuah you have to make, says Rav Huna. Okay, so everybody admits that that's not a shvuah l'shav, that's not a wasted or false shvuah. You have to make that shvuah. Now, there are two ways of looking at shvuahs. One is you make the shvuah and you lie, and there is monetary damage. That's for that you have to bring a korban asham. Okay, we're going to talk about karbanos here in a minute. And then there's another lie where you don't tell the truth, but it does not result in the loss of money. You still make that shvuah, but your chiyuv is a korban ola. So we know that an ola is a much lighter carbon than a korban asham. So if you lie and you steal money as a result of the lie, that's an asham. That's a terrible thing. If you lie, what we like to call maybe a white lie, but if you lie and it doesn't materially change the facts of owing anybody any money, then we don't like that, but we only make you bring a korban ola. Okay, that's the background. With that background, we're now going to impose it on our Mishnah of the Socher and the Shoel to figure out what, if anything, anybody did wrong and what korban they have to bring. And that's going to bring us around to answering some of our questions. Amar Rav Yirmiyah, the bottom line of Lamed Hey Amid Beis. Amar Rav Yirmiyah, Pa'amim sheshneim bechatos. There are times when both the Socher and the Shoel will tell a lie, but they only have to bring a chatos, an ola. In other words, they have to bring a lighter korban. We'll get to it in a minute. Pa'amim sheshneim ba'asham. There are times when both of them have to bring a korban asham because their lie resulted in a monetary loss. Right? That's a difference. Also, pa'amim shehasocher bechatos v'hashoel ba'asham. There are times when they both lie, but the lie of the socher does not result in a theft or exchange of money, and all he has to do is bring a chatos. But the shoel's lie is more serious, and he has to bring an asham. And pa'amim shehasocher ba'asham v'hashoel b'chatos. And then there are times when the socher is the one who lies to the extent that he has stolen mamish, and he has to bring an asham, and the shoel only a chatos. So we have four circumstances: two when they're both a chatos, two when they're both an asham, one where the socher is a chatos and the shoel is an asham, and one where the socher is an asham and the shoel is a chatos. Okay, so everybody understands the ground rules now. The ground rules are clear that somebody's lying and we don't like it, but the Torah has made it in Vayikra, has said specifically that you bring this particular carbon for this particular event, for this lie. And it ties the lie to theft. If there was a theft, that's more serious and it's an asham. If there was no theft, but you lied anyway, you got to punish you for the lie, and we punish you with a chatos. Okay, now, Frank the Gemara on the third line, Haketzad. How does this happen? So it's like I just said, I gave you a preview. Kefiras mamen asham, the denial of money brings about an asham, but bitus fasoyim, just moving your lips. Moving your lips is a euphemism for telling a lie that doesn't have serious ramifications. Bitus fasayim chatos, but bitus fasayim is a chatos. So let's take a look at, let's go back to the Lamed Hayim and Beis on the bottom, that Rashi. It goes in our Mishnah, Hasocher v'hashoel, nishbu l'shaker, they lie, v'lo kafru mamon, and they don't steal. V'harehem b'shvuas bitui, that's called a bitui. V'korban shalom chatos, k'diksiv, v'vayikra, oy nefesh kishava, kisishava, that if a person swears and he swears falsely, then he has to bring a carbon. So Rashi specifically says that they both lied, the socha and the shoel lied, but there was no monetary loss. So obviously monetary loss is very critical in this whole equation. So then you only have to bring a chatas. Now, the top of Rashi on Lamed Vav Amin Aleph, Shnayim ba'asham in nishbu l'shaker, if they swore falsely, kefiras mammon, and that also ultimately led to a denial of money, meaning theft, right? Zukar b'shvu shalahem asham. Then he has a carbon asham, and he quotes from that pasuk, Ayel ben Beishanim diksiv behavias ashamo Ayel tamim be'erkecha kesef shnei shkalim v'hu gezelos. Okay, fine. So very clear distinction that a theft brings about a carbon asham and the other a carbon chatas. Now let's get to the actual facts. How does this happen? Okay, sometimes both of them bring a chatas. How? Now here it's going to be important to remember what the various responsibilities are for the socher and for the shoel. And we just discussed those. Socher is responsible for pshia, geneva, aveda, because he's renting and he owes a greater responsibility to the owner. The shoel, wait a minute, the shoel is getting a freebie. So not only does he take upon himself pshia, aveda, geneva, but also ones. So he has one further level of responsibility that the socher does not have, simply by virtue of the fact that he's not paying for his for taking the animal. Okay, so it died of natural causes, not of its burden. It didn't die because it was carrying a package and had a heart attack. It died Mesa Kedarka. It was old. It died. It happened. Amru Nensa, and they lied. They all lied, and they said Nensa. What does that mean, Nensa? Nensa, it could mean there was an accident. Something else happened to the animal. It didn't die of natural causes. Nansa. So socher, now the socher, the benkach or benkach mufter, the socher is potter from oines. So even though he lied, that lie meant nothing because it didn't add a layer of responsibility. He's potter anyway from Nansa. So what does he have to bring? A chatas. So he has to bring a chatas. Shoel, a shoel, the benkach or benkach chayiv, the shoel is in either case chayiv for ones. He also brings a chatas. Why does he bring a chatas? Because his lie didn't incur any further cost. He lied. Okay, but there was no theft of money because he's chayiv for ones anyway. So we have a situation where the socher can lie and only brings a chatos because he was never responsible for ones. The shoel, who was responsible for ones, what difference does it matter how the ones came about, whether it came about by Mesa Kedarka or Nansa? It's still the same ones, and he's still chayiv anyway. So he hasn't lied to get away from payment because he can't get away from payment. So this is an example where both of them bring a chatos, except that the socher is off the hook and the shoel is on the hook. Shoel's got to pay anyway, but he doesn't. Whether he pays because of ones or Mesa Kedarka doesn't matter to us. You understand? In other words, he lied, and that's called bitus v'sayim, but he didn't change the character of the responsibility. The character of the responsibility is he still has to pay. Okay, so that's the first instance of both having a chatas. There are times when they both have to bring a carbon asham. Why? Because they changed the fact pattern and stole. It was stolen. Okay, the animal was stolen, and when the owner confronted him, he said, "Oh, wait a minute! No, this animal died through work." Now, remember Rav Huna shvur. That shvur you have to make and say, "I don't have it." So he doesn't have it. Okay, he doesn't have it. But how did it die? Well, he said it died because of malacha. The travaya ko kafre mamona. They're both denying money. The homachayve v'ko patre nafshe. Okay, a shoel is potter from mesa machmas malacha. Remember, the shoel has the greatest responsibility. So for Geneva, he would be paying. But for mesa machmas malacha, he's off the hook. If they both say it died because of mesa machmas malacha, no one has to pay, because that's the one exemption, is when you rent or borrow an animal, you cannot be responsible when something happens to the animal that shouldn't happen under your watch. It shouldn't die machmas malacha. That's why you rented it. You rented it as a beast of burden. So if it dies because of the burden, you can't be responsible. So since the socher lied, he has to make a shvur, right? I mean, he has to make a shvur and bring a carbon asham, and the same for the shoel, because the shoel, his only exemption is mesa machmas malacha, but it didn't die mesa machmas malacha. It was an ones. So we have a case where both of them have to swear and bring a carbon asham. The swearing part is easy. Everybody has to swear. The question is, what do you do as far as karbanos goes? So here we have an example that both of them are mechuyev to bring a carbon asham. Now, the third case, okay, 1 second, let me just repeat. Shol the mechayev b'mesa kedarka because potter nafshe b'mesa machmas malacha ba'asham. Okay, now socher ba'asham v'shol b'chatos. The next case is where the socher has to bring a carbon asham and the shoel brings a carbon chatos. Why? Because it was stolen. So right away the socher is responsible, and he gets off the hook. Rama mesa kedarka, and he's potter for mesa kedarka. So Socha the Mechayev Begeneva Vaveda V'Kapota Nafsha B'Misa Kedarka Ba'asham. He lied to get out of a monetary payment by saying that it wasn't stolen. It makes a Kedarka. Shoel the Benkach Chayev B'Chatos. He's responsible in any event. In other words, when we say you bring a carbon chatas, it doesn't mean you're off the hook. It means no matter which way you look, you're chayiv. So he didn't enhance his lie with anything by saying Mesa Kedarka, because Mesa Kedarka is the same as Geneva as far as the shoal is concerned. He's chayiv on both. So now we have a situation where the socher is mechayiv. Okay, so the socher is chayiv in Osham and the shoal is chayiv chatos. And then the last case, we just flip it around by saying that it's the shoel who's chayiv in the chatos, and the socher is chayiv in the chatos, and the shoel is chayiv in the asham. Anyway, bottom line for all those four cases is the lie sometimes enhanced the ability of the party to get off the hook, and sometimes it didn't change the quality of his responsibility. When it doesn't change the quality of responsibility, just merely lying, that's called bitus fasayim, that only engenders a chatos. It's only when you lie and you change the quality of what you owe, whether you owe money or not, that's what brings about the carbon asham. Okay.
Rabbi, I want to go back to Menashe's insightful question. It's broader than that. But if the shoel becomes a sub-renter without the knowledge, and there's nothing precluding that in the agreement, then what I don't understand.
Are you saying a sub-renter?
In other words, he's a sub-renter. In other words, instead of being a shoel borrowing it, he pays a rental fee to the renter.
To the socher. Okay, good.
Right.
Yeah.
But it seems to me that in any case, that the renter, the primary renter, should be responsible to the owner regardless, and that if there's secondary damages to the shoel, or if he becomes a sub-renter, then he should be responsible. So it should go down in stages. It should be the primary.
I understand your point.
So how do we account for, in the case of a shoel, the renter not being responsible because he did it without the knowledge of the owner?
Right. So, okay. So let's take a step back. When we learned this Mishnah, we said the chain of events was that the socher rented it to the shoel, and the shoel then used it, and something happened in the possession of the shoel. So, sui generis, in other words, without any of the particulars that we are now trying to hang into this case, you're asking a moral question. I mean, your question goes to the heart of the fairness of what's going on here.
But it's even a halachic question.
Aren't you asking a question of fairness?
No, I mean, the agreement was between the first two. When the agreement
said nothing to prohibit or restrict.
No, but then that is on the renter, because the shoel, if he wants to rent it, he's taking the responsibility, and the shoel's responsibility is to the one who rents, and not to the owner. Correct. I mean, he has to make good to the owner. So why is it, does the two questions. One is, why isn't it the shoel off the hook as it relates to the owner? Because it wasn't with the approval of the owner that he became a shoel. So the renter is responsible. And if he becomes a sub-renter, does that put him in the shoes of the renter if the owner has knowledge?
Okay, so let me confess to you that your question is the very machlokes of Rav and Rabbi Yochanan about 10 lines further down in our Gemara. That very question becomes the center point of a machlokes between Rav and Rabbi Yochanan, whether one shomer, one class of shomer, who delivers it to another class of shomer, whether he can remove his liability by giving it to someone else. For instance, in life, in normal life, if I give you something, I'm expecting you to give me that something back. You do something with that item, why should I look to anybody but you? You're the guy, you're the person I dealt with. So inherently, the fairness is that I should come to you and not worry about Menashe or anybody else. Okay, so Rav and Rabbi Yochanan dispute that. Rav and Rabbi Yochanan put conditions on what I just said as to whether or not you and I have privity to the exclusion of anybody else. One says there is privity and the other says there isn't, and we'll explain that. We can't do it right now because that's a separate machlokas. But what's gnawing at you and what's bothering everybody else is that there is a basic sort of injustice here or imbalance in the way this transaction is happening. So you have to stop for a minute and you have to think back to the time of the Gemara and you have to say to yourself, okay, maybe they weren't as sophisticated as we were with all the nuances. But what they had going for them was the fact that everybody played a role. Everybody had a name. You were an owner, you were a renter, you were a borrower, you were this, you were that. And in that role, there are obligations and responsibilities. So the Gemara took it upon itself to say that if you become that role, you have those responsibilities. I don't have to articulate what it is. You should know yourself. A shoel is chayav for this. A shomachinam is chayav for this. Shomasachar is chayav for this. Everybody has his own sense of responsibility, and you do not have to articulate. Now, the key question is, and this is Rabbi Yossi adds this to our Mishnah at the end. He is asking the question that you're all asking here. He says, where is fairness? The owner is the one holding the bag. What's fair about that? So Rabbi Yossi disputes the Tanakama, and he says, you know what? And again, we said last week that that's not 100% clear because it depends on when it died. But he says to the socher, step away. I rented it to you. You gave it to the shoel. I didn't prohibit you from giving it to the shoel, but let me deal with the shoel. Let me deal with him, and I'll get my animal back, and you won't be the worse off. Okay, I'll give it to you for 10 days to work, whatever, but you won't be the worse off. So the Mishnah is trying to give us a full picture and saying that, you know what, it isn't all that bad because the owner does have rights and the owner can impose his rights. Now, the Tanakama doesn't agree, but according to Rabbi Yossi, the owner can impose his rights and say to the socher, don't stand in the way of me getting my animal back because I only rented it to you. I got to deal with the shower. But with regard to your question, Michael, that is a very important question that Rav and Rabbi Yochanan are going to dispute as to whether or not when you transfer it to another entity, meaning from your possession to another possession, whether you out of the picture entirely, or do I still have liability? And that, by the way, lahabdil is a major issue in any monetary transaction. Is if I deal with you and you deal with a third person, do I absolve you? Let's just say in the case of a rental, you're renting something from me, and I know who you are. You're a rich guy, and I know that you're going to make good, no problem. You will go ahead and give it to a third guy who's not as wealthy as you. Now, what happens if there's damage or an accident and the cost is greater than what the other guy can absorb? Do I have a right to come to you because you're the rich guy and I say, Michael, you got to make up the difference. I didn't rent it to the third guy. You did rent it. I didn't prohibit you, but you can't be off the hook just because you rented it to a third guy. That whole discussion falls into the category of Rav and Rabbi Yochanan, which we will talk about next week. and it's an important kasha, and you're right asking it. The key question here that we're dealing with right now, which we want to finish, is whether or not between a socher and a shoel, who each have responsibilities, can they get out of, let's say, the korban chatos or the korban asham by telling a lie? And what we have to come away with here is knowing that a lie is still a lie, and the Torah says you're responsible for that lie, but we're not going to make you do a korban asham, a more serious asham, if your lie doesn't involve monetary matters that you're stealing or someone's getting hurt. If the same result comes about, but you lied, we want to punish you for the lie, korban chatos, but we don't want to punish you with an asham because your lie was not as meaningful. So we have layers, unfortunately, we have levels of lies, a white lie, a red lie, a black lie, whatever, and each lie has a different punishment. So, okay, so let's just look back in the Gemara to finish what we started. Frank the Gemara, my kamash malan. What's the chiddush here? If a lie is a lie, and you have to bring a korban, as Rashi says, there's a Mishnah in Shavuos which articulates all this and says very specifically that a bitus fasoyim, a white lie, does not require requires only a chatos, and a lie which is kaifer, where you deny the money, is a asham. That's a Mishnah. We have that Mishnah in Shavuos. What did Rabbi Yirmiyah come to Mechadish? Rabbi Yirmiyah gave us this whole pisman today of everybody's chayv and chatos, or asham, or half or half or half. What did he articulate here? There's more than the Mishnah in Shavuos. So let's finish that. Says the Gemara, la'afuke mid Ravi Ami, that the reason why Rabbi Yirmiyah is needed is to exclude Rav Ami. Why? What did Rav Ami say? Because Rav Ami said that the Omar kol shvua shahadayonim mashbian oso. If there is a court-imposed shvua in chayv maleh mishum shvuas bitui, that you're not chayiv because of shvuas bitui. In other words, if it was not voluntary, but it was a bezdin ordained shvua, then you are not chayiv for the korban. Shenema o nefesh kishava levata b'sfsaim kishava ma'atzma. Chomash malon the lo karavam. So again, the chiddush here is that Rav Yirmiyah is telling us is it's not like Rav Ami, because Rav Ami had this different position, and his position was that if Bezdin requires you to make a shvua, it's different than if you make a shvua on your own. So Rav Ami, and Rav Yirmiyah says, no, I don't hold of that. There's no difference between a Bezdin shvua and your own shvua. So because of that pasuk in Vayikra, Rav Yirmiyah had to include and say, no, you cannot make that distinction between whether Bezdin imposed the shvua or not, and at the end of the day, you have to make the shvua. All right, that ends this Gemara, and now we understand why Rav Yirmiyah said what he did. But all the questions from this morning, we have to push over to next week, because not next week when we start this Gemara, now we're going to really get to the heart of what the question is, whether or not one shomer, one class of person, can transfer to another class and basically remove himself from liability. We haven't discussed that really in total. We talked about karbanas, but now the next step is to actually see whether you, who I rented to you, and then you rented to a third party, what's the real scoop? Who's responsible? And we talked about that a little bit in a different context when we talked about Rishus to Rishus, that when you change Rishuyos, then sometimes there is a sort of change of that change of Rishus has an impact. But here it would have a direct impact on whether or not the owner can collect money, or whether someone can slide out from under the collection and say, it wasn't me, I don't owe you. So that's next week tomorrow, Mitzvah Shem. But for our purposes, when we talk about karbonis, which again, it's important, but not everybody today we don't bring karbonis. But the fact is that there is a difference between a chatos and asham, and we have to accept that. And the fact that a white lie, which we don't condone, only brings about a chatos. Okay, that's a slap on the fingers. But if it brings about an asham, then you've got a slap on the wrist. So that's how the Gemara concludes it and says that there's no chiluk between whether or not Bezdin imposes a shvua or you voluntarily admit. In both cases, a chatos is for bitus fosayim, and an asham is for kofar when you deny the entire when you deny it. So that's how the Gemara leaves it. And again, I think one of the things that we talk about a lot is understanding the context of the Gemara in today's world, because today we have so many more sophisticated safeguards and things that we can do to basically vitiate these problems. I mean, these problems wouldn't happen in our time. They happened there because no one articulated and said, don't rent it to someone else or don't lend it to someone else. So it gives rise, and that's how the machshava of the Gemara works. That's why we sharpen our own thinking, because we're looking at hypotheticals that may or may not happen today. But once you start imposing different cases, it helps you understand what we're doing. You know, that our safeguards today are much more in place than they were in the time of the Gemara. So today you wouldn't ask that question, who's responsible if he gives it to the third person? What do you mean? The contract says who's responsible. It's there. They didn't have so many contracts. It was more Baal Peh, and people sort of played a little bit loose as to whether or not there were responsibilities between the people. And that's what makes the Gemara so interesting, is because we're taking ourselves back a couple thousand years into a time that was well before what we understand is business transactions. Today we're very sophisticated. We know what we're doing. We think we do. But in the time of the Gemara, there was more, I would say, maybe trust or reliance, or maybe they didn't suspect that people would do certain things. But you asked the question several times, Michael, and you're right. Who gave him permission to do it? The teretz is, in the absence of permission, there's permission. He didn't tell him not to do it. He didn't say, don't lend it to someone else. So he was a nice guy and he lent it to someone else. And Rashi told us, or in the Farshim in previous week, nothing wrong with that. He can do that as long as it was not prohibited. So again, we have to take all this into context. So but with regard to Kabbanis, we know the answer. And it's next week when we start in the Machlokes between Rav and Rabbi Yochanan, we'll get right to these questions of whether or not if I'm a Seicher and I give it to another Seicher or something like that, what my responsibilities are. Now the Gemara will go into that in greater detail.
So in those days, the assumptions about human behavior were more higher integrity and less of a shtiklach, how can I get around something?
Right. I think that's an interesting way of putting it, is that there was a certain purity that they did not really sort of get into the weeds to try to. Today, our contracts are sometimes hundreds of pages because we give heichatimtzis for what might happen, if the cow jumped over the moon. So you want to cover every contingency. They didn't worry about that, like you said, right? They didn't worry about every contingency, and they allowed certain things to happen. And when they happened, now you have to go to Bezdin and deal with it. So Bezdin has to extrapolate and say, what did he really mean? Did he mean you can't lend it to someone else? No, he didn't say that. We're not going to assume that the Soicher can't lend it to the third guy. But you don't want to make the whole owner, hold the bag. So how are you going to reconcile the two? That's what the challenge was at the time of the Gemara, is to make sure that everybody, that it was fair.
Well, it's obvious that they were more ehrlich than they society.
I think today our
the threat of a shvua was such a terrible thing.
Right, exactly.
Today, nowadays, a lie, it's not a problem.
It's not a problem. You're right. So Niskatnu Hadoros, the Doros have changed, unfortunately, not for the better.
Yeah.
And in the time of the Gemara, they were able to make assumptions on a higher moral plane than we are today. Today, unfortunately, without all of the codification and the documentation, we would probably be much more of a it's bad enough, but we'd be a lot worse in terms of fighting with each other, litigating with each other, because all of a sudden I would challenge you and you say, wait a minute, it's in the contract. If it wasn't in the contract, we're out of luck. And by the way, that's what happens in these very complicated insurance and other matters. Those of us who deal sometimes with those issues, you see how complicated it is because since we pile
no
on,
trust.
what?
There's no trust. There's no basic trust.
There's no trust. So unless I give you every I dotted, T crossed 3 times, you'll find a way to say, wait a minute, this T wasn't crossed enough. You can't do that. And that's not good. That makes it for a very complicated issue. In a way, the time of the Gemara where they said less and left more to interpretation was sometimes easier to overcome the issue and find a solution. So listen,
Sure, yeah.
that's why we have this Gemara, to sharpen our minds, to think about things that don't normally happen in our life. But now you extrapolate from this what the norm should be. That's the beauty of the Gemara. So, all right, so we'll stop here. At least we have some understanding now, a little bit of Karbanis. But next week, Mr. Shem, we're going to get right into this question that all of us have been, Michael and you, Jay, and everybody's been asking is, okay, so what happens? What's the real Metzias of these transactions? So Mr. Shem, next week, we'll continue on Lamed Vav Aleph.